Good evening and a warm welcome to this much anticipated, of course, a great event. Of course, it is the annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture here, of course, at UNISA in the heart of the capital, Pretoria. Of course, the event itself has started, and this year we're marking the 17th, of course, commemoration of this particular lecture that we know that has been taking place over the years. Of course, we're also marking the 39th anniversary of course, the liberation icon's death in detention. Of course, you would remember, according to history, he died just a stone throw away from here at, of course, the then known as the Pretoria Maximum Prison, now known as the Kgosi Mampuru Correctional Facility, that is really just 2 minutes away from UNISA. Now, of course, a lot of dignitaries are in attendance. We've got, various members from civil rights movements who are here. We've got, of course, former President Nelson Mandela's wife, Graça Machel, who's in attendance, former President Thabo Mbeki's wife, Zanele, First Lady Zanele Mbeki, who's also in attendance, a lot of members of cabinet, a lot of members of media, various political party members who are here. So it's a packed event. And of course, I think the highlight for, of course, the evening is the keynote speaker. As you would know this here, we have, of course, the African American liberation icon, and that is Professor Angela, of course, Davis, who will be delivering the actual memorial to honor the liberation hero that is, of course, Steve Biko. So it's a packed event. The program has started. So without wasting time, let's go back inside and hear what is happening inside right now.
It seems that I should visit South Africa more frequently. Let me tell you what a great honor it is to have been invited to deliver the Steve Biko Memorial Lecture this year. And of course, I'd like to thank the Vice Chancellor, Professor Makanya, Professor Fakenya, and Obenwa Amponsa, the CEO of the Steve Biko Foundation, for inviting me. I have been asked to speak about the legacy of Steve Biko, about my own experiences as an activist, and about contemporary struggles for justice. So let me begin by honoring the legacy of a man who immersed himself in struggle, who worked collaboratively to radically transform lives and institutions, a man whose life and work have inspired so many people in South Africa, in the United States, and throughout the world. I am especially happy that I had the opportunity to meet and converse with Steve Biko's wife, Mrs. Ntsiki Biko, and with his son, Nkosinathi Biko, along with a number of people involved in the foundation. Let me say that I'm extremely honored to be in the presence of the two First Ladies of South Africa. Thank you so much for attending. And I've had the opportunity during the 2 days that I've been here, less than 2 days, to meet with a number of people, activists representing several generations, people involved in the Stephen Biko Foundation. And today I had a very brief but very inspiring visit to the Mandela Archives at the Mandela Foundation. I chose the topic, Legacies and Unfinished Activisms, because I think it captures some of the dilemmas of the contemporary moment. We are called upon to celebrate those whose dreams and whose activisms made it possible for us to inhabit this present. And as dissatisfied as we may be, and in fact we should be with the present, this is a present that was ushered into being by the transformative impact of past revolutionary struggles. The disjuncture between what we once imagined as a future of freedom and justice, and the present, whose unfreedoms and injustices have become as apparent to young people as those of the past were to us, this disjuncture produces new dynamics of struggle. I thus constantly remind myself that the revolution we were fighting for at some point began to recede to the background and became the increasingly unacknowledged backdrop of the victories we did win. The revolution we wanted was not the revolution we helped to produce. So when I reflect on the current moment, when I reflect on the United States, I ask myself, what might we have done differently had we known that the election of the first Black president would be followed by the farcical election campaign we are currently experiencing? I asked myself whether a greater insistence on the hidden structural dimensions of racism, the economic, cultural, and generally institutionalized forms of racism which fostered the continued development of a huge psychic reservoir of racism, whether such an insistence might have made a difference, the kind of difference that might have prevented the Trump campaign, and I will mention his name only once, that might have prevented the Trump campaign, that's twice, from trafficking with the white rage, from trafficking with the white rage that is a product of the growing inequalities generated by global capitalism. These white people who are suffering, who know that their children will be worse off than they are led to attribute their misfortunes to the rise of people of color. And so the open appeal to racism comes in the form of the representation of Mexican undocumented workers as rapists and criminals, and the equation of Islam with terrorism. The subtext, of course, with the open attack on President Obama is that Black people and other people of color have usurped the places and privileges which rightfully belong to white people. From a very early period of my activism, South Africa was our primary beacon of hope. From my earliest years as an activist, I eagerly read Sechaba. and the African communists. My comrades and I embraced the leaders of the ANC and the leaders of the South African Communist Party as our leaders. Solidarity with the anti-apartheid struggle infused our movements against racism, our movements for social justice with a vast reservoir of energy. And the release of Mandela in 1990, the victorious election in 1994 brought collective euphoria to Black communities and anti-racist struggles everywhere. Here, at last, was the path to freedom. I would not have been able to imagine then that 2 decades after the defeat of apartheid, we would be confronted with militaristic responses to people's protests. But before we immerse ourselves in the chaos of the current moment, let us visit the source of our legacies. This evening, we are memorializing Steve Biko. Steve Biko offered us a politics of Blackness that released it from the constraints of inferiority and let us know that Black people could collectively embody humanity and the foundational impulse toward freedom. Blackness was to be reimagined and reconstructed in the very process of collective struggle. As Mandela said of Steve Biko, living, he was the spark that lit a wildfire across South Africa. His message to the youth and students was simple and clear. Black is beautiful. Be proud of your Blackness. And with that, Mandela continues, he inspired our youth to shed themselves of the sense of inferiority they were born into as a result of more than 300 years of white rule. Black was not only proclaimed to be beautiful, Black would become the sign of a trajectory toward human emancipation. In Biko's own words, it becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are those who have lost their personality. The first step is to make the Black man come to himself, to pump life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. This was a stirring, powerful statement. But I must also point out here that the political discourse of the time had the effect of foreclosing the participation and the acknowledged conscientization of those who did not fall under the sign of the male gender. And as we know, some of the most passionate activists in the student movement of that period were women. And we know that the first major protests, so to speak, the mother of all protests, had been the Women's March to Pretoria on August 9th, 1956. And so I have kept in my mind the image of that monumental gathering. Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Albertina Sisulu, Fatima Mayer, Florence Mofoso, Ruth Mompati, Sophie Williams-De Breen, and all of the 20,000 women staging a silent protest here in Pretoria in front of union buildings. Now you have touched the women. You have struck a rock. You have dislodged a boulder. You will be crushed. Women have always been at the heart of anti-racist and progressive activism. We thus have to give ourselves permission to honor the women activists as we celebrate the legacies of the men who have come to represent the struggles of the past. And those men who most deserve to be celebrated, men like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X in the United States. In South Africa, men like Nelson Mandela, Chris Hani, and of course, Steve Biko. As influenced as they may have all been by ideologies of patriarchy, of heteropatriarchy, their work helped to create a discursive arena for the development of Black feminist consciousness. They were also aware that their leadership was precisely enabled by those with whom they struggled, and not only the men, but the women as well. We are thankful, profoundly thankful for these legacies, but we do not receive them uncritically. Our understandings of the past are very much determined by our positions in the present and by how we imagine the future. From the perspective of the present, we can apprehend what was hidden behind the restrictive discourses of the past. Steve Biko died so that we would be able to develop these perspectives today. And we understand today some of the silences, some of the erasures, some of the foreclosures of those past struggles. We have also learned important lessons from the arrests Biko endured, from his imprisonment, from the torture, and from the long struggle to reveal the true circumstances of his death. Biko organized students. Students have always been at the forefront of radical change. An essential dimension of the learning process is critical thinking. Learning how to question things as they are, learning how to imagine the possibility of something different is the very essence of education. Facts are easily attainable, especially today. People who have access to the internet have access to infinite libraries of factual information. But what do we do with that information? Steve Biko and his comrades led vast numbers of students to raise questions about apartheid and to imagine a different world, even as they clashed with the world as it was. Knowledge is useless unless it assists us to question habits, social practices, institutions, ideologies, the state. This questioning cannot end, even when victories are won. Even when victories are won. Students are now recognizing that the legacies of past struggles are not static. If these legacies mean anything at all, they are mandates to develop new strategies, new technologies of struggle. And these legacies, when they are taken up by new generations, reveal unfulfilled promises of the past, and therefore give rise to new activisms. As an activist of Steve Biko's generation, I have to constantly remind myself that the struggles of our contemporary times should be thought of as productive contradictions, because they constitute a rupture with past struggles, but at the same time they reside on a continuum with those struggles, and they have been enabled by activisms of the past. They are unfinished activisms. Activisms enabled by the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955, which was at its core a women's boycott. It was a women's boycott. By the August 9th Women's March 60 years ago, by the founding of the Black Panther Party 50 years ago, almost exactly 50 years ago. It will be 50 years in October. By the uprising in Soweto 40 years ago. By the struggles undertaken by Biko and his comrades to create the South African Students' Organization. By the struggles of Nelson Mandela and the heroic members of the ANC. By Mkhonto Wesiswe. This is the genealogy young activists share across oceans. The young activists of today stand on our shoulders. And precisely because they stand on our shoulders, they see something of what we have seen. But they also see and understand a great deal more. They are beginning to address unresolved questions and some of the erasures and foreclosures about which I spoke earlier. They stand on our shoulders, but we do not provide a steady foundation. Precisely because our questions were questions of a different era. Our critiques were expressed in the inadequate discourses of the past. And the young activists want to reveal the erasures. They want to question what we did not have the full capacity to question in our time. Therefore, they sway, they teeter-totter, they falter, they make terrible mistakes, just as we did at their age. When we stood on the shoulders of those who came before us, but just as we learn from our mistakes, they must be allowed to learn from theirs. They must be allowed to learn from theirs, even when it appears that they are simply repeating our mistakes. One of the truly exciting dimensions about the activisms, both here in South Africa and in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, is that they're being led by women. I had the honor of meeting Nopindulo Mikachwa, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Who is the current president of the Student Representative Council at WITS, and Shaira Kala, who is the past president. And under their leadership, the contestation of the fee hikes, fees must fall, began to resonate across the country and around the world. There's some who've said that the student demands are unrealistic, especially when students begin to call for free education. But the demand for free education is only realistic because we continue to live with the mandates of capitalism. And we are compelled to think about education as a commodity. Especially in the aftermath of the global Occupy movement, the thoroughgoing commodification of education under the dictates of capital is increasingly viewed by progressive activists as an obscenity. This is not the way things should be. Freedom should mean, in the very first place, the freedom of education, the freedom to learn. And the prerequisite for enjoying freedom of education should not be the capacity to pay. It should not be the capacity to pay. If students are calling for free education, they are reminding us how retrograde our social priorities have become. The demand for free education reminds us of the world we should be inhabiting. It reminds us of the legacies that have produced impulses toward the future. When they move from no-fee heights to free education, they remind us of the revolution we need to be fighting today. The three young women in the U.S. who first produced the hashtag Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who first produced the hashtag Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of the vigilante racist killing of Trayvon Martin. And then went on to create the network Black Lives Matter. As the Ferguson protest erupted 2 years ago, these young women are collectively striving to remind us of the revolution we need as they try to develop strategies for struggle today. There has been an uneasy relationship with the veterans of the movement that came before them. The uneasiness emanates from the fact that veterans often take themselves and their knowledges too seriously. Sometimes we assume that our questions and the tentative answers we provided to those questions deserve to be accorded a permanence that silences future questions and answers. Sometimes we look for leadership in the familiar guise, the charismatic male leader who in the U.S. historically has emerged from church communities or religious circles. And when we cannot find that form of leadership, we say their movement has no leaders. But they answer back. Our movement is full of leaders. We are not a leaderless movement, we are a leaderful movement. And the Black Lives Matter movement seeks to build new forms of leadership, feminist leadership. Leadership, whether of women or men, queer, trans, or straight. Leadership that is collective, inclusive, and democratic. And so perhaps we now need the leadership of those who have been historically barred from leadership positions, those who have been silenced. Perhaps we need leadership that will assist us to develop new vocabularies. Vocabularies that encourage inclusiveness and interconnectedness, vocabularies that recognize interdependencies, intersectionalities, and internationalisms of our struggle. In other words, vocabularies that highlight the feminist dimensions of all of our social justice struggles. We have learned how our languages and our institutions, including our prisons, participate in the reproduction of ideologies of gender that violently exclude those who cannot find themselves within binary gender structures. Trans women of color have brought new analyses of our institutions, especially institutions of punishment, which have deepened our understanding of the importance of abolitionist approaches. Prison abolition, which calls for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, and the abolition of policing as we know it, must also involve the abolition of racism and the abolition of gender policing and a constant critique of heteropatriarchy. We have learned about the symbiotic interconnectedness of state violence and intimate violence. We now perceive an economy of violence in which the symbiotic relationship of different modes of violence, state violence, institutional violence, intimate violence, thrives on excess violence directed at certain communities, for example, trans communities of color. Revealing these reservoirs of violence and openly challenging them helps to diminish the overall economy of gender violence. The message of the Black Lives Movement is that Black lives are not abstract and fungible lives that can be subject to repression under the sign of the universal equality of human beings. The Black Lives Movement challenges what we might call the tyranny of the universal. And I say that there's something very important and very powerful that Black lives offer. Histories and temporalities and languages and aesthetics and possibilities of freedom. Possibilities of freedom. This tyranny of the universal was first challenged, I believe, in political, social action by the Haitian Revolution. If we examine struggles against slavery everywhere, we know that in every important movement there were resonances of the Haitian Revolution. The insistence by women and men who came to call themselves Haitian that to be human is to collectively struggle to be free. There is no such thing as freedom for a single individual. We know that freedom, as it has been conceived under bourgeois democracies, has always been a limited freedom, a freedom accorded to racial, class, and gender elites, a freedom that acquires its value precisely because of its powers of exclusion. There is a direct line from Haiti as the world's first anti-racial democracy, thus the world's first true democracy. There's a direct line from that revolution to the Black Lives Matter movement today. The insistence on the particularity of the Black predicament is precisely that which is capable of yielding a robust universality. Because for most of our history, the very category human has not embraced Black people. Its abstractness has been colored white and gendered male. But there are those who think that by removing race from the equation, by saying, instead of saying Black Lives Matter, by saying all lives matter, we somehow magically transcend race. But of course, if all lives mattered, we would not need to emphatically proclaim that Black lives matter. And if you look at the Black Lives Matter website, you will see Black women matter, Black girls matter, Black gay lives matter, Black bi lives matter, Black boys matter, Black queer lives matter, Black men matter, Black lesbians matter, Black trans lives matter, Black immigrants matter, Black incarcerated lives matter, Black differently abled bodies matter. Therefore, to say that Black lives matter is to say that Latino and Asian American and Native American and Muslim and poor and working class white people's lives matter. It is to say all lives matter. And so, as it turns out, the very particularity of the claim Black Lives Matter leads us toward a richer, more inclusive, less hierarchical universal. It leads us not toward narrow, exclusive nationalism, but rather towards expansive, capacious internationalisms. These internationalisms are symbolized by the strong ties that have been developed between Palestine solidarity and Black Lives Matter. Indeed, South African movements supporting the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Solidarity campaign, have given leadership to people all over the world. A particularly strong affinity between Palestinian struggles and Black Lives Matter activists emerged when activists on the ground in Palestine 2 years ago became the very first to offer solidarity and advice to the Ferguson protesters through social media. Since Palestinians recognize that the canisters being thrown by the police in Ferguson were manufactured by the same company as the tear gas canisters used by Israeli police and military in Palestine, they tweeted out advice to their sisters and brothers in this small town in Missouri, in Ferguson, Missouri, as to how to deal with the militarized police who were attacking them. The globalism of police militarization was challenged by the globalism of resistance. History tends to elude us in the very process of its becoming. We always seem to falter when it comes to recognizing the present as history. Clarity only seems to emerge when we can no longer affect the passage of historical time. Although we can never predict definitive outcomes when we are entangled in abundant and the complex circumstances of the present. And Stuart Hall pointed out that there are never any guarantees for our struggle. Nonetheless, it is our collective duty, to imagine possible futures. When Muhammad Ali refused to be inducted into the military in 1967, we could not know at the time that this would become an iconic historical moment, as was the raising of the fist by Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the Mexico Olympics in 1968. Perhaps Colin Kaepernick's refusal to stand during the singing of our militaristic national anthem that is replete with oral images of bombs bursting in air. Perhaps this will become another such moment. Or perhaps the actions by the girls at Pretoria High School. And we've seen many images of Zuleika Patel. This moment may very well be the historical conjuncture we have been waiting for. We cannot really know, but we cannot let it pass without asserting our collective agency in order to begin to purge our societies of racisms, including Islamophobia and settler colonialism, as well as anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, assaults against immigrants and refugees, and the unremitting capitalist assault on our environment and on our food sources and on the sentient beings who endure pain and torture as they are transformed into food for profit, food that generates disease in humans whose poverty compels them to rely on McDonald's and KFC for nourishment. Even though there are never guarantees that we will reach the futures we dream, we cannot stop dreaming. We cannot stop dreaming, and we cannot stop struggling. Not even if, and I say when, we begin to see the crumbling of capitalism. There will always be vibrant legacies. There will always be unfulfilled promises. There will always be unfinished activisms. Thank you very much.